I want to take you back to the beginning of our era. That would be, and our era would be September 11, 2001. And think for a second about that evening. George W. Bush comes back from his peregrinations during the day. He started the day at Sarasota, Florida, reading at Goat to a class of, I don't know, what were they, 7 or 8-year-olds. He then flew to various Air Force bases around the country because they were afraid to have him come back to Washington. And finally, he came back to the Situation Room, had a meeting, gave a speech to the country, and then outside of the Situation Room, he bumped into Richard A. Clark, who's Richard A. Clark?
Counterterrorism.
He's this counterterrorism chief, and the man who, for the last 3 months at least, and increasingly for the past month, had desperately tried to get the White House to focus on the fact that all the chatter was showing and suggesting that an attack was about to come. And he actually, at a certain point, said there's going to be blood and glass in the streets. We have to do something. And of course, that meeting never came until exactly 1 week before 9/11 on September 4th, 2001. That moment outside of the Situation Room, George W. Bush collared Richard A. Clark and said, I want you to try to find out, work hard to find out whether Iraq was behind this. And Richard Clark was rather shocked at that because he had just given a briefing, among other things, that said that, in fact, Al-Qaeda had been behind this. Al-Qaeda had done it. They had already found Al-Midar and Al-Hamza, the 2 names of the hijackers, on the flight manifest of the plane that smashed into the Pentagon. So they already knew at that point, on the evening of September 11, 2001, that in fact Al-Qaeda had done it. I want you to imagine for a second that George W. Bush, instead of saying that rather portentous, giving that portentous job to Richard Clark, had instead said, look, Dick, who are we fighting? Who is this enemy who has just attacked us? Who has killed more Americans on American soil than any attack in the history of the country? Point them out to me. Show me who they are. Show me what we can do about it. Now, Richard Clark would have pointed to a map, and let's imagine this is a satellite map, and he would have said, well, Mr. President, Al-Qaeda, well, frankly, I can't really point them out to you because they're not big enough. They're really just 1,000 or fewer than that operatives who are basically over here somewhere. They're in Kandahar, the area around Kandahar. They're moving to Tora Bora. But from a satellite map, we can't even see them. The enemy is so small, is so tiny, right? Now, if we cut forward 13 years from that moment, let's go to the next slide, we see that the enemy has expanded and we absolutely can see them, right? We can see them along the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, which is where core Al-Qaeda is, who still include perhaps 1,000 operatives, even though many have been killed in drone strikes. They keep reproducing themselves. We see them in Yemen, the group Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, which is perhaps 1,000 fighters. We see them in Al-Shabaab in Somalia, another 1,000 to 2,000 fighters. We see them in, if you want to define them rather broadly, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria. We see them in Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, here, about 2,000 fighters. And finally, and most dramatically, we see them in this rather huge swath of territory covering the border between Syria and Iraq. It is, in the journalistic way we define this, as about the size, larger than the state of Maine, that territory. We always need a American state to compare things to when it comes to overseas expanses of geography. But that group is, of course, the Islamic, now simply called the Islamic State, or ISIS, or ISIL. So the question I think that we have before us, and that we have been considering the first part of this class, is the crucial one of how this tiny group of men, very dedicated men, who are over here somewhere, in these various training camps have expanded into what is in fact a worldwide movement, which we can call, along with our author this week, Al-Qaeda and its affiliated groups, or we can call, as I like to do, we can call it viral Al-Qaeda. That is the affiliated groups plus a great many people around the world who are supporting Al-Qaeda. I gave you at the beginning of the class a kind of figure that I'm going to repeat now, and that is, imagine a target. A target. I think I drew it up on the blackboard. And imagine in that red center of the target, the bullseye, these operatives, these men, because they are almost entirely men, who are willing to sacrifice their lives on the altar of jihad. Suicide bombers, fighters, people who are taking out Kalashnikovs, AK-47s, and are ready to die for this cause. In the center of those, perhaps now you have, including the Islamic State, you might have 40, 50,000 people, including the Taliban too, if you want to put those in the group. 40, 50,000 people in that red hot center. The second loop, or the first loop, excuse me, around the red hot center, we can say are the people who are actively supporting these groups. They're the couriers, they're the people who do things for the group, they're the people who actually give money, they're the people who are active supporters. And that next loop in the bullseye, or around the bullseye, are the people who support them, but perhaps not actively. The next loop are the people who are ambivalent about them. The next loop are people who are not sure either way. They're Muslims, but they're not sure that they support them. And I suggested that the worldwide strategy of the United States should have been, at the beginning of this war, to do things that would keep people from moving toward the center. That is, to keep people from becoming more radicalized, to keep Al-Qaeda's recruitment down, to keep its numbers down, and to gradually start sending people out from the center. In other words, if you're going to eliminate Al-Qaeda, you have to do it in some kind of political way that's eventually going to dry up its recruitment. Okay? Now, in some way, as we've just seen on this map, the U.S. has done the opposite. The U.S. has sent people into the center of the target by its actions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about strategy, okay, which is what the general discussion is about. Strategy. What was Al-Qaeda trying to do on September 11th, 2001? And I would suggest they have two goals, or they had two goals. One of them, as I just suggested, was to boost recruitment, right? Dramatically boost recruitment, and to do that by creating an enormous recruiting poster. And in that, they used the main weapon on September 11th, which wasn't box cutters. It wasn't bombs that the hijackers supposedly had in their luggage. The main weapon on September 11th was the television set. Okay, it was creating this enormous worldwide image that would say to Muslims around the world, especially those disposed to support this group, those who were frustrated, those who hated the United States, those who hated the autocratic rulers, say in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, that the United States supported, that this image would say to them, look, if you join us, or if you support us, or if you send us money, we can win. We can defeat the United States. So one of the purposes that day was to recruit, and it indeed had an enormous impact. You had a great deal of recruitment. You had people joining jihadist groups, and especially Al-Qaeda. The second thing it was meant to do, and this we know from documents from Saif al-Adil, for example, who was Osama bin Laden's military chief, it was an attempt to draw the United States out of its hole. To draw the United States out of its hole. That's a quote from Saif al-Adil, who was an Egyptian, a colonel in the Egyptian army, and then served Al-Qaeda as a military chief. Now, what does that mean? Well, what they planned was that what would the United States do as in reaction to these attacks? What the planning of Al-Qaeda was, or the expectation of Al-Qaeda was, that the United States would invade and occupy Afghanistan. Right? It would take over this territory. It would do it like the Soviets had done it 20 years War in 1979. And like the Soviets before them, the United States, the Americans would get bogged down in a quagmire. They would be attacked by both the Afghans and the Afghan Arabs, and they would be destroyed. The quagmire would destroy the United States military, it would destroy the United States as a superpower, and the U.S. would withdraw, not only from Afghanistan, but from its responsibilities in the Middle East, because this is absolutely critical. As we learned in Lawrence Wright's book and elsewhere, there was a specific goal that these jihadists have, right, and Al-Qaeda in particular, which is they want to withdraw American support from regimes that they want to destroy, and those regimes include the Mubarak regime in Egypt, the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. And the theory is once that support is withdrawn, those regimes will fall, okay? So they attack the far enemy, which is the United States, in order to make vulnerable the near enemy, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There are other near enemies as well. These are regimes and rulers who are in Jahiliyyah. They're apostasy, they're lost in idolatry, but this is one of the ways you're trying to destroy them, okay? Now, what did the United States, so this is the strategy of Al-Qaeda, the rough strategy of Al-Qaeda. What was the United States strategy? Well, the United States, instead of doing what was expected, the United States did, of course, attack Afghanistan, but it did it with a handful of troops, special forces troops. The occupation came later. The United States attacked Iraq. Let's go on with the slides and go to the Iraq side. The United States attacked Iraq. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, some of which we'll talk about in subsequent classes. But why did the United States, there's Yemen, this is Al-Qaeda influence in Yemen, which we mentioned a moment ago. This is the sectarian division. Okay, let's leave it on this. This is the sectarian division of the Middle East, which we can talk about in a moment. The United States attacked Iraq. I mean, I think there are a number of reasons for that. One was the restoration of prestige. We talked about, and this book also talks about how terrorism diminishes the prestige of imperial power. One of the reasons the United States attacked Iraq, and I think there are a number of different reasons, we can argue about them, but one was certainly the restoration of its prestige. Menachem Begin, the former Prime Minister of Israel and former terrorist with the Irgun, a terrorist against the British, said that terrorism dirties the face of imperial power, and the attack on Iraq, among other things, was supposed to clean that face, clean the face of imperial power. Henry Kissinger said, when asked why he supported the attack on Iraq, he said, because we have to humiliate them the same way they humiliated us, or even more than they humiliated us. So, the United States attacks Iraq. It's supposed to be a rapid war. Okay?
I just don't understand that, like, quote in terms of invading Iraq, though.
Okay.
Because
yeah.
if they weren't related to Iraq, then why does that
I think
solve this
the
situation?
idea of imperial prestige gets to the notion of we are a great power. We are going to show that we can, in a few weeks, take on the greatest military power in the Middle East, with the exception of Israel, the greatest Arab military power. We are going to invade. We are going to destroy its army. And we are, within a period of 3 or 4 weeks, going to have a convoy of American tanks rumbling down the capital of an Arab country. And the Arab country thought to be the most powerful. We are going to show that we are strong. We are going to return, any imperial power must keep up its military authority. There's a difference between military power and military authority. Military power is the power that you have to destroy things. How many tanks you have, how many bombers you have, how many aircraft carriers you have. Military authority is something more elusive. It's basically your ability to get what you want without using your power. Okay? You don't want to constantly have to invade countries. You want to be able to make your wishes clear and have people do what you want without actually using your power. And one of the things that terrorists did on September 11th is it reduced dramatically the military authority of the United States. Now, I don't want to pretend as if there weren't other reasons for this attack. I mean, obviously, oil is behind everything simply because it's the Middle East, of course. Weapons of mass mass destruction, I think were not. There were some people in the administration convinced that was an issue. I don't think that was something made up or fabricated. I think people believed in it, but it was rather a pretext of the war. Protecting Israel, you can go into other reasons, but the fact is that the United States invaded, and they picked a singularly terrible place to invade. The reason is that Iraq is divided between Sunni and Shia, as you all know. It is basically on a kind of situational crossing ground in the Middle East, right? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so here we have Shia, here we have Sunni, here we have Kurd. And what this means essentially is that Shia goes this part of Iraq and then into Iran, right? Iran is over here. Sunni goes this part of Iraq and then into Syria, into Jordan, into Saudi Arabia. So that this crossing ground, though enclosed in one country, actually represents a kind of civilizational dividing line that adds an enormous propulsion to a guerrilla war. Does everybody understand that? I mean, when the Iraqi guerrillas, Sunni guerrillas started attacking American forces, they were supported to some degree by the Syrians, to some degree by the Jordanians passively, and to some degree by the Saudis as well. When the Shia militias struck back, they were supported not only by the Shia government, but by Shia Iran. Okay, so you have a war that's in one country, but that is nourished by forces outside of that country. A similar thing happened in the 1990s with Bosnia in southeastern Europe, right? You had Bosnia, which is divided between Muslim, Christian Orthodox, and Catholic. And those forces came together in that small place and made that war especially virulent. Now, the United States theory at the beginning of this war was, we're going to get in, we're going to conquer the country, we're going to liberate the country, we're going to get out. The original plan was the United States forces were going to be out by September. They went in March, they're going to be out by September, except for a small 10 or 20,000 force left there, but most of them would be gone. That was the original plan, right? It did not quite work out that way. There was an enormous amount of looting at the beginning. The Americans never achieved military authority over Iraq, which is to say they never achieved authority on the ground. Political authority was defined by Weber as attaining a monopoly of the legitimate use of force. A monopoly of the legitimate use of force. And the United States never quite achieved that in Iraq. So what did you have? Instead of a quick invasion, which created this thriving post-Saddam republic, possibly democracy, who knows what it would look like. Instead of that, you had a disastrous, grinding guerrilla war, which continued on the ground and which offered daily images, daily beautiful television images of Americans repressing Muslims. Okay, Americans repressing Muslims. I saw a lot of these missions myself when I accompanied American troops. An improvised explosive device would go off, would blow up a Humvee in front of the convoy. Somebody would be injured, somebody would be killed. The troops would fan out of the convoy. They would put barbed wire around a neighborhood. All the tanks carried barbed wire on them and so on. They would cordon off, which is the technical term, cordon off a neighborhood. They would bust into one house after another, smash up the furniture, throw the male members of the household on the ground, humiliating them, put them face down, slip tie their hands behind their back, put hoods over their head, put their military boots on the back of their heads, the males, while they smashed up the house and searched everything. And then the so-called military-aged males would be thrown into Abu Ghraib. You know, completely crazy. So you had this enormous growth in the number of detainees in Abu Ghraib. You had this widespread repression that everybody was aware of on the streets of Iraq. And you had this growing population of detainees. Abu Ghraib quickly took on 15,000, 20,000 prisoners, you know, a huge population of prisoners, almost 90% of whom, it was later admitted by American forces, should not have been there. There were guys men who just knew nothing about the insurgency. But many of them left prison determined to join the insurgency. Okay? Now, these brimming prisons in Iraq, not just Abu Ghraib, but Buqa, Camp Victory. There were a number of prisons in the country. Added by this time, we're talking about the middle of 2000 or the end of 2003, the beginning of 2004, added to this enormous worldwide detainee population that was growing in Guantanamo, where you had 800 prisoners, in the so-called black site, where in Afghanistan, Bagram Air Base, and in the black sites, secret prisons around the world. Does anybody want to guess? I don't know if I've given you this figure before, how many people were imprisoned at the height of the detention regime the United States established? I think it was 2005 was the largest number of detainees. Anybody want to guess? Well, 2005, there were 85,000 detainees, 85,000 around the world. The piece, Associated Press piece in which this was summed up, said that these people would just fill Federal Stadium where the Redskins play. So a lot of these people, for example, the detainees in Guantanamo Bay, it was widely known, most of them were picked up as the result of bounties paid to local farmers and local people. That is, if you bring to American forces an Al-Qaeda person, if you bring an Al-Qaeda person in, we will pay you $5,000, a huge amount of money. So that roughly, as we read in one of our books, roughly 5% of these people had actually been arrested by American forces. Yeah.
Are we talking Iraq and Afghanistan, or just Afghanistan?
No, that's that number I gave you is the whole world.
I mean the like Al-Qaeda detainees, because I know that happened a lot in Afghanistan, because you just pick out an Arab and send a Pashto.
The 5% figure I'm giving you is numbers in Guantanamo. So they're coming from Afghanistan and to some extent Pakistan. They're huge numbers.
Were they paying people off in Iraq the same way that they were in Afghanistan?
No, they weren't. Now, I want to say just a word, because it's in our title, about torture. Because by this time, in 2003, the United States is torturing detainees. And this is a complicated story, and we're about to get into it and tell you a little bit in more detail how this actually happened. You've seen it in a couple of our texts so far, but I want to just give you a little introduction to what exactly was being done, and I'm going to introduce you to the case of Abu Zubaydah, who is someone who was arrested in March of 2002 in Faisalabad, Pakistan. He was believed by the Bush administration to be the number 3 person in Al-Qaeda, which was completely false. He was never the number 3 person. In fact, he wasn't even a member of Al-Qaeda. But he was a kind of logistics chief who was responsible for moving Al-Qaeda people around the world. So he was, in fact, a valuable detainee. It was announced after he was arrested, Bush announced at a campaign rally that he'd been captured. He'd actually been shot and nearly killed when he was captured in Faisalabad. Bush said, we just captured this high-ranking Al-Qaeda guy, Abu Zubaydah. He's no longer plotting against us. He's where he should be. Now, where he should be? Well, he'd been flown off to a black site. Secret prison. This one, as it turned out, in Thailand. Then he was moved to Afghanistan. Eventually, he was moved to Guantanamo. The United States, in the person of the CIA, had put together a network of black sites, secret prisons around the world, in Thailand, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Romania, Poland, Lithuania, Morocco. There are probably others as well, but we certainly know about the ones exact in those sites. And you had the secret prison population, which was not acknowledged, officially acknowledged, which is to say, even though the president announced publicly, and Donald Rumsfeld announced publicly that this guy had been arrested, it was not acknowledged officially that he was under United States capture. So we had, in effect, he in effect was disappeared, even though it was unofficially acknowledged he was captured. It was not officially acknowledged. If you were Abu Zubaydah's family, you had no way to find him. You had no way to get in touch with him. You had no way to know where he was. And I'm going to read you a little bit about what was done to him in the black site. Because I think it's important that we have a sense of what these procedures were. We're going to study them a little more in the next few weeks. This is from a report. He was interviewed by the Red Cross in Guantanamo in 2006. So this is actually the words of Abu Zubaydah. We have the accounts of a number of detainees, 14 of them actually, who told us in rather dispassionate terms what was done to them at these sites. He's probably at this point in Thailand, although he doesn't know it. He has no idea where he is. They're kept naked. They're kept in very cold rooms. The first phase is kind of sleep deprivation, which I will actually describe to you in a second. Okay. Now, he wakes up from a coma. I woke up naked, strapped to a bed in a very white room. The room measured approximately 4 meters by 4 meters. The room had 3 solid walls, and the fourth wall consisting of metal bars separating it from a larger room. I'm not sure how long I remained in the bed. After some time, I think it was several days, but can't remember exactly, I was transferred to a chair where I was kept shackled by the hands and feet for what I think was the next 2 to 3 weeks. So he's put in a chair, shackled, and simply kept there for weeks. Doesn't get out to sleep, nothing. During this time, I developed blisters on the underside of my legs due to the constant sitting. I was given no solid food during the first 2 to 3 weeks while sitting on the chair. At first, I was only given Ensure and water to drink. Ensure is kind of a mineral supplement. At first, the Ensure made me vomit, but this became less with time. The cell and room were air-conditioned and were very, very cold. Very loud, shouting-type music was constantly playing. It kept repeating about every 15 minutes, 24 hours a day. Sometimes the music stopped and was replaced by a loud hissing or crackling noise. During this first 2 to 3 week period, I was questioned for about 1 to 2 hours each day. American interrogators would come to the room and speak to me through the bars of the cell. During the questioning, the music was switched off, but was then put back on again afterwards. I could not sleep at all for the first 2 to 3 weeks. If I started to fall asleep, one of the guards would come and spray water in my face. Now, have any of you ever pulled an all-nighter? Okay. Has anybody ever done 2 in a row? So stayed up 2 nights? Or, well, you know what starts to happen after 2 nights? You start hallucinating. You don't know where you are. You don't know how much time has passed. You're kind of completely oblivious. You start drooling, and all sorts of strange things happen. Well, he thinks it's 2 to 3 weeks. In fact, we know from other documents that he's kept awake for 11 days. No sleeping at all. Kept in that chair. Other prisoners in this first, what's called the conditioning phase, they stopped using the chaining to the chair and they would chain them to the ceiling. They would chain their hands to the ceiling. They were kept naked in a highly air-conditioned room. Very often they were diapered. So naked except for diapers.
So did they call it the conditioning? Did
They call it the
forces
conditioning
call it the
phase.
conditioning?
And we will look at some of these documents and actually see how the American forces talk about it. But let me read you just a little bit more from a later phase of the interrogation. This is called the coercive techniques. This is the third phase of the interrogation. After the beating, so he's beaten and smashed against a wall. This is called walling. They put a towel around his neck and smash his head against the wall, which is called walling. After the beating, I was then placed in the small box. They placed a cloth or cover over the box to cut out all light and restrict my air supply. As it was not high enough even to sit upright, I had to crouch down. This is kind of this little coffin, this kind of half coffin. It was very difficult because of my wounds. Remember, he had been wounded when he was captured. The stress on my legs held in this position that my wounds, both in the leg and stomach, became very painful. It was always cold in the room, but when the cover was placed over the box, it made it hot and sweaty inside. The wound on my leg began to open and started to bleed. I was then dragged from the small box, unable to walk properly, and put on what looked like a hospital bed, and strapped down very tightly with belts. So this is kind of a gurney. A black cloth was then placed over my face, and the interrogators used a mineral water bottle to pour water on the cloth so that I could not breathe. After a few minutes, the cloth was removed and the bed was rotated into an upright position. The pressure of the straps on my wounds was very painful, so he's strapped still. The thing is rotated upright, so he's kind of hanging from the straps. I vomited. The bed was then again lowered to horizontal position and the same torture carried out again with a black cloth over my face and water poured on from a bottle. On this occasion, my head was in a more backward, downward position and the water was poured on for a longer time. I struggled against the straps trying to breathe, but it was hopeless. I thought I was going to die. I lost control of my urine. Since then, I still lose control of my urine when under stress. I was then placed again in the tall box. While I was inside the box, loud music was played again, and somebody kept banging repeatedly on the box from the outside. I was then made to sit on the floor with a black hood over my head until the next session of torture began. The room was always kept very cold. This went on for approximately 1 week. I could go on with this account, but the fact is Abu-Zubaydah's waterboarded, and that is waterboarding, one definition or one explanation of waterboarding. He was waterboarded 83 times. The 83rd time, people at the black site told headquarters, look, he's compliant. We don't think he's holding information back. We think he's talking and giving us what we need. We don't need to waterboard him again, but headquarters insisted on waterboarding him again. Because they did not believe, and this is kind of a consistent theme of torture at the black sites, they did not believe that headquarters did not believe that he was telling all he knew. Okay, so this is kind of the middle term in our trio of terror, torture, and drones. Why do I think torture is very important? Not only for moral and legal reasons, which are important in themselves, but because torture, Guantanamo, the images of what was happening at Abu Ghraib, the images of those prisoners on their knees at Guantanamo, was an absolutely critical effort in Al-Qaeda's recruitment in the Middle East. Not just Al-Qaeda, but other jihadi groups. Those images, when we see now James Foley, for example, kneeling in that wilderness of a desert before he's miserably beheaded, what is he wearing? He's wearing an orange jumpsuit. Everyone in the Middle East looks at that and thinks Guantanamo. Everyone looks at that and thinks Abu Ghraib. They get it instantly. It's amazing to me, though, that most Americans don't. Most Americans don't realize this is a reference.
I guess just an interesting anecdote. As I mentioned last class, my father was in the military and like prior to the Vietnam War. And when he went through training, they had to go through like this wilderness training, where at the end they were supposed to have been caught by like enemy forces and had to endure like torture practices.
Right.
And all of what you just listed was involved in that training, like the small bombs that they were forced to stay in.
We will actually get to that. Many of these techniques, as Erica points out, were originally derived from SEER training. That's survival, evasion, SERE.
Yeah.
I forget what it's.
It was
But
like-
this is Eddie American Flyers actually had this training. We will talk about that. It's an interesting argument from the time these techniques were first approved. One of the arguments about their legality was, well, Americans had endured them. But of course, Americans, whenever they needed to, could say stop.
Yeah.
It was a safety sign.
And it was much
So,
shorter. It was only the course of like 5 days.
It was
6
very,
days.
very short. Okay, so torture and the detention regimes that were built upon it were enormously helpful in Al-Qaeda's recruitment efforts. And one of the reasons why when we look at that map and we see these Al-Qaeda affiliates thriving around the world, one of the reasons that they were so successful. Now the third element here is drones. I want to say a little bit about them. That's going to be the kind of last third of the class. That is the last third of the course, rather. We'll get to drones and we'll talk about them rather extensively. But I want to impress on you that these themes lock together. That is, that the first part of this war, from say 2001 to perhaps 2005, 2006, was a war that was fought, and we had the era of the big wars, the large military engagements, which was Iraq and then Afghanistan. But you had underneath a kind of intelligence war being fought in which operatives in the United States were capturing, with the help of Pakistanis and other local forces, were capturing people in Al-Qaeda and people affiliated with Al-Qaeda, taking them to black sites, or kidnapping them and using extraordinary rendition, which is sending them to our allies in the Middle East, including the Egyptians and the Syrians, who would torture them. The idea was we snap up a lot of these people, as many as we can, and we interrogate them, and we exploit them for their intelligence value, which meant, in many cases, torturing them. This is phase one of the war, and then the information from them would be used to capture other people, send them to black sites, send them to extraordinarily render them to allies in Syria or Egypt, and interrogate them. And this would go on and on. And we have a kind of transmutation of the war happening about 2006, 2007, where George W. Bush starts to make larger use of drones Drones were first used in 2002 in Lebanon, or excuse me, in Yemen, and then were used as a favor to kill a major figure that the Pakistanis wanted killed in 2004, and finally in 2007, 2008, George W. Bush issued secret orders that allowed the CIA to strike with drones in Pakistan without the approval of the Pakistanis. And drone strikes spiked.
What year is it?
This would be 2008. United States, by 2008, the United States was launching a drone strike an average of every 10 days. And that year, the US killed with drones about 350 people. Under President Obama, those numbers increased dramatically. By 2010, the CIA was striking Pakistan with Hellfire missiles. Hellfires are what are shot by the drones, by Predator drones and Reaper drones, which the Reapers are larger. By 2010, the CIA was striking Pakistan with Hellfire missiles on average every 3 days, and that year killed about 1,000 people. Okay. Now this is what I define as Obama's light footprint strategy. What is a light footprint? Well, you withdraw from the major wars. That is, you get all the troops out of Iraq. You surge in Afghanistan, but eventually get all the troops out of Afghanistan. And then you establish a seemingly permanent covert war, which is fought with special operations forces. During this time, special operations forces of the United States doubled in number. They're currently fighting in 70 countries, raiding, training, or involved in 70 countries around the world. And it's fought with unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs or drones, in South Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and increasingly the Horn of Africa. I want to read you a brief account of what it's like launching a drone strike from Northern Virginia, from CIA headquarters in Northern Virginia. This is from Newsweek magazine. The place, so this is an office, you know, you're driving around Northern Virginia, you see a bunch of office towers, there's a huge amount of money that's invested there. I think I told you before that not only did the military budget double since 9/11, the intelligence budget quintupled. It was originally about $30 billion, so you do the math. Huge amount of money goes into intelligence. So one of these new office buildings, inside, you can't see from outside, it's just a kind of glassy office building. Inside, the place is filled with computer monitors, keyboards, and maps. Someone sat at a desk with his hand on a joystick. John A. Rizzo, who was serving as the CIA's acting general counsel, so he's the CIA's lawyer, hovered nearby along with other people from the agency. Together they watched images on the screen that showed a man and his family traveling down a road thousands of miles away. The vehicle slowed down and the man climbed out. So they're watching this on a computer screen. A moment later, an explosion filled the screen and the man was dead. It was very businesslike, says Rizzo. An aerial drone had killed the man, a high-level terrorism suspect, after he'd gotten out of the vehicle while members of his family were spared. The agency was very punctilious about this, Rizzo says. They tried to minimize collateral damage, especially women and children. Okay, so this is in an office building in Northern Virginia. Who was this man who was killed so punctiliously in front of his wife and family? Well, we don't know who it is. It could have been Pakistan. It could have happened in Pakistan, where in the decade since 2004, the CIA has launched nearly 400 drone strikes, 400. Killing somewhere between 2,500 and 3,700 people. About 1 in 10 of these is civilians. So the upper boundary of the number is 3,700, 3,700. Or perhaps it was in Yemen, where since beginning, as I mentioned, in 2002, but especially since 2009, the CIA and the US military, both of them, have launched 100 or so attacks, killing as many as 1,000 people, of whom 100 have been civilians. So we're talking about total numbers of probably 4,500 to 5,000, and probably 10% or so have been civilians. Now these numbers are they're not notional, they're estimates. They're very hard to confirm them, but probably they're lower end estimates. I'm giving you a boundary. Another thing to say here is that a lot of these strikes are so-called personality strikes. That is, they're assassinations for people who are known. A very large percentage are so-called signature strikes. A signature strike is when you strike someone simply because of their behavior. You You don't know who they are, you don't know the identity, but they're acting in some way like a terrorist, according to certain signature behaviors, and so it is legitimate to kill them under this interpretation. Okay,
Does that still stand?
it
Yeah.
still stands. It was brought in with Obama, although it's known that Obama didn't much like signature strikes. So the secret drone war shows no signs of coming to an end. It's Obama's signature policy, right? The light footprint approach. His answer to how, after you end these occupations in Iraq and Afghanistan, how you continue the war on terror. I mean, the political attractions of this are obvious, right? Because Americans don't care that much that you're killing people on the other side of the world when you are putting no American forces at risk. I mean, the American forces are sitting in that office room, in that office tower in Northern Virginia. Okay. David Sanger has a quote about this. These quiet weapons, quote, dramatically expanded the president's ability to wage non-stop, low-level conflict, something just short of war every day of the year. So this is the quiet war that's going on even as we stand here. The drone attacks continue. Now, one thing that has happened obviously in the last couple of months is a war has begun against the Islamic State, which we have been following. I want to read you from this thing that was we passed out last week. Islamic State recruitment soaring in the wake of U.S. bombing. Obviously, this is not an obscure dynamic. We've talked about it before. When you get the United States to attack and to bomb, you very often increase recruitment. The Islamic State jihadist organization has recruited more than 6,000 new fighters since America began targeting them with airstrikes last month, according to the UK-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. So 6,000 new fighters since the American airstrikes began. At least 1,300 of the new fighters are said to be foreigners who have joined the Islamic State from outside the swaths of Syria and Iraq that it controls. The United States has launched some 165 airstrikes on IS targets since early August. This piece was written in mid-September. The bulk of the foreign fighters who've signed up in the past 6 weeks are aged between 15 and 20 years old. Okay, and have never been involved in conflict before. So, the United States basically is helping to draw a huge number of recruits to the Islamic State. I mean, 6,000 for an organization that's estimated to have at most 30,000 members is a very large number of recruits, right? It's increased by 20%. Now, we see reflected in the book we read for this week, the Terrorism Lectures, a couple of things that terrorists are trying to do when they launch attacks. One is to increase recruitment. One is that Marighella theory, which is talked about in the book, that you conduct violent attacks and you give the violence meaning, or in other words, propaganda and other forms of communication. Then you launch a terrorist campaign which would force the government to reveal its inherently repressive nature, thereby alienating the public. Which is to say, you force the United States to attack, to bomb, you show its inherent nature. Its inherent nature, obviously, is the U.S. represses Muslims. It performs its role as the imperial power in the Middle East, and you therefore increase recruitment to your organization. Okay, so one of the reasons when we get back to that original map that showed the number of the large numbers in the organizations since 2011, one of the points here is that the United States has helped do it to itself. And this dynamic, I mean, one good question here is, of course, how could we have done it differently? Obviously, the Iraq War, in very many ways, was a catastrophe, and the Iraq War gave birth to the Islamic State. The Islamic State is, in fact, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or Al-Qaeda in the land of two rivers. It's simply the current generation of it. But there are a number of things that the U.S. could have done differently, and I think the first thing it could have done differently was make a sober estimation of who these people were and why they were fighting and what techniques should be used that will not make them stronger. And I think the United States never quite did that. Never made a clear judgment about who they were, and never designed its techniques to keep their numbers small and shrinking rather than to add to their numbers. I want to conclude by this part, anyway, this discussion, with a quotation from George W. Bush's address to Congress on September 20th, 2001. He said, "We have seen their kind before." He was talking about Al-Qaeda. "We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. By sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power, they follow in the path of fascism and Nazism and totalitarianism. And they will follow that path all the way to where it ends in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies." Okay, so I mean, it's a very bizarre quote. I mean, it's got references in here, will to power to Nietzsche, history's unmarked grave, that's Trotsky. I don't know why the President of the United States is quoting Nietzsche and Trotsky. He probably didn't know he was doing it. But it is an interpretation of Al-Qaeda that is completely, I would argue, misbegotten. It's misplaced. Because indeed, Al-Qaeda is not the Soviet Union. Al-Qaeda was not Nazi Germany. And the United States responded to Al-Qaeda as if it was the new Cold War. You could tell that in part from the rhetoric. It's very similar to the Truman Doctrine rhetoric. You're either with us or you're against us. The Truman Doctrine, was there are two alternative ways of life, and everybody must choose one way or another, one side or the other. Bush administration was very similar. And we had, as we'll talk about in some of our reading this week, we had a very similar reversion to Cold War methods that were, I'm arguing, completely misplaced in fighting Al-Qaeda. And that's one of the reasons we're still trapped in the emergency state. And one reason, if we take stock of the forever war today, I would argue things look very grim. Even though there's not been a large-scale mass casualty attack on American soil since September 11th. In fact, these groups have grown dramatically. We have not only Al-Qaeda surviving and affiliated groups of Al-Qaeda thriving, but we also have the so-called leaderless jihad, which you read about in terrorism lectures, which is simply unaffiliated, sympathetic people, activists, who go on to launch attacks with a minor degree of help from core Al-Qaeda. And, Mr. Shahzad, who tried to blow up his SUV in Times Square in 2010 was one of those. Mr. Abdul Talib, who tried to blow up his underwear over Detroit, even though he did get significant help from Yemen, Al-Qaeda in Yemen, or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, was one of those. We can name a number of others, and it means that one of the things we've done since 9/11 is increase the single thing that's needed for this movement that's fighting against the United States, and that is political will. That is the political will to actually attack. And the internet makes it, as James J.F. Forrest tells us in this book, the internet makes it very easy, as long as you have willing participants, to figure out how to make a suicide belt. The London bombers of 7 did that. They actually did this attack pretty much on their own because they got that knowledge from the internet and everywhere else. So, if we take stock of the forever war, at this point in 2014, as we begin this war against the Islamic State, the latest phase of the forever war, I would say things are looking fairly grim from the point of view of the United States strategy. Yeah.
The other, or I think it was last week, there was a gunman who entered the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa. Would he be classified as one of these leaderless jihadists?
Yeah, he might. That's a good question. He might well be. I don't think we know very much about him at the moment.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Colonel Nadal Hassan, or excuse me, was it Colonel? Major Nadal Hassan, he's a major at Fort Hood, who killed 13 people. He would be another example of kind of the leaderless jihad types. This is named after, of course, the leaderless resistance. It should be said that these techniques, and the drone technique in particular, is politically, as I mentioned, extremely attractive because you're not killing or putting at risk Americans. So you just have these drones going on the other side of the world, you launch them, you kill these people, Americans don't care about it. So politically, it has almost no purchase at all, right? I mean, it's very attractive. If you're Barack Obama, it's a very attractive technique. The country is exhausted with war, they're exhausted with overseas engagement, so you just have drones, which are just killing people on the other side of the world. So what's the problem with them? And I would say one big problem is that it's a tactic, it's not a strategy. The Israelis refer to their techniques in Gaza as mowing the grass. In other words, in Gaza, you're going to have to go in and kill people every couple of years because they grow back. So you go in, you kill 1,000 people, 400 or 500 of whom are Hamas activists, or militants, or insurgents, whatever you like to call them, or terrorists, as the Israelis call them. You go in, you kill 1,000 of them. 2 years later, you go in, you kill 1,000 again. 2 years later, you go in, you kill 1,000 again, and you are mowing the grass. And the problem with mowing the grass is the grass tends to grow back thicker than it did the first time. It continues to grow back, and it is a tactic, not a strategy, because things tend to get worse. Okay, let me just look at toward drones, a tactical response to the threat of imminent attack, right? They're good at stopping imminent attack, even though technically it's now, we only strike with drones according to the president when you have a threat of a continuing imminent attack, which if you follow the English language is a rather strange term, continuing imminent attack. Usually it's imminent and then it happens. Continuing imminent is a bit strange. National security lawyers now talk about elongated imminence, which essentially eviscerates the term. I mean, if you're claiming that you only are attacking militants who are about to attack the United States, you cannot have elongated imminence. That is, you can attack them for weeks and weeks on end. But in fact, it turns out that we're spending a lot of time attacking not only the heads of these organizations, but foot soldiers as well. And as I mentioned, we've killed probably 4,500 of them. I want to give you a quote at the end of this from the Stimson report on drone warfare. The increasing use of lethal UAVs, that's unmanned aerial vehicles, may create a slippery slope leading to continual or wider wars. The Israelis refer to such continual interventions that I mentioned as mowing the grass. Bruce Rydell at the CIA says the problem with the drone is like your lawnmower, you've got to mow the lawn all the time. The minute you stop mowing the grass, it's going to grow back. Even as the grass is cut, the seed's planted for it to grow back again. So drones appear seductively low cost, low risk. No pilots can be shot down and captured. Few civilians are killed relatively, maybe 10% at this point, probably less. The American public cares little, the political cost is negligible, and yet they're a stopgap measure. They disrupt and prevent attacks at the expense of nourishing and expanding the movement itself. Relying on them implies an inherent movement toward expansion. Applied narrowly at first to address specific threats, they gradually become the go-to method for dealing with groups who pose much more diffuse political problems to policymakers. And the more they're used, the more they're needed. As they kill enemies and create more, they've come to look like a deadly perpetual motion machine, or the prime symbolic instruments of a permanent war. And that's what we've reached, the stage here of a permanent war, which is based on tactics and based on a failing strategy. Okay. Yeah.
I was wondering if you think, because